Welcome to the Rollwise Podcast, the weekly show that explores all things RPGs. My name is Mike, one of your hosts, and I'm joined by my fellow RPG enthusiasts, Brent.
Howdy, everybody.
And Jeff.
Hey, everyone.
So settle in, and let's kick off this week's show. So this week, it's probably going to be a little bit of a shorter discussion, as we're going to cover Shadowdark. On Monday, we'd actually had a bit of a game. We'd played through the mechanics just to give it the good old honest college try. Because sometimes, when you do an impression just from reading the rules and everything like that, it really just stays in that theory craft realm. You don't really get to see how it interacts and plays and all those things that really tell you if you fall in love with the game, or if it's a game that maybe you like to try it, but it just didn't stick. So we're going to give you a lot of information about our impressions, and however long that takes, that's what it's going to take. So without further ado, let's talk about Shadowdark. So first of all, Shadowdark, OSR game, rulings over rules. Now, I know that I did a pretty good read on the books, and I think one of the things that I ran into was the fact that there wasn't a ton of rules to go over. I actually kind of missed some rules as I browsed through it. So there was some things that I noticed that I could have probably done differently in the gameplay that we had, just because, I'm not going to say I got lazy, but I'm just going to say that my brain made certain assumptions for how the game worked. and that was more my fault. But the good news is that really the game is rather simple, and so we're going to start with characters, and we actually followed the character creation process to a T, to an I, whatever you want to call it. And so why don't you start us off, Brent? How did character creation process work for you? How did you feel that OSR style played out? And then we'll tap you, Jeff, for your impressions, that we'll kind of discuss from there.
Well, I think the one of the things that I think is the benefit, is the strength of OSR style games, is character creation is pretty quick. I think what slowed us down a little bit is some of the random generation. Like, I think the rule where if you don't get a 14, you re-roll the whole table is strange, because
it's optional. You don't have to use it.
Right. Or you can have a weaker character, or you can roll the whole table, which I think is a weird optional rule, because it could cause you to re-roll a lot. Just re-roll the tables over and over and over again, which I think adds to the length of character creation. And then sometimes I think with OSR games is you get this general feeling that everything's important because it's so minimalist, so it takes more time. You think about things maybe too much, was I think one of the roadblocks that I have. But it was, straightforward, roll 3d6 straight down the line. I'm not the biggest fan of random character creation, so and I don't do it that often, so it was new to me, but it was easy, simple, and then putting the character together was simple, like most OSR games. So
good.
Yeah.
All right. And Jeff, what were your impressions having this character going through the character creation process and everything like that?
I agree with Brent. I think I was overthinking some stuff, especially because my character had a really low strength, which only allowed me the minimum number of gear slots, which is fine. That's part of the trade-off, right? Not being able to have a billion things. It does make your choices somewhat important. I think I overthought it a little bit, but I'm going to be honest, it was refreshing to find a character sheet that literally took up less than half a page, that I understood everything that was on there and didn't have to ask questions. Modern character sheets, man, there's a lot going on, and not all of it's used, and not all of it winds up being important. And so I found that part actually kind of refreshing, But yeah, the constraints are tough. I wound up rolling a 1 hit point character, managed not to die in the
2 hours that we played.
In the 2 hours that we played.
Well, we only played for an hour though, so
2 hours. 2 hours.
Character creation took a little bit longer. Yeah,
character creation counts.
But yeah, it's like any character creation. There's good and bad. I had a lot less questions than I have with other systems, so it was kind of refreshing, I thought. And
Yeah.
the next time I did it, I can probably do it in a quarter of the time I took the first time.
Yeah, the more reps you do with that sort of system, the quicker it'll be.
Mm-hmm.
You'll also know what you need. Like if you play that game a lot, you'll know what you need. So there'll be a lot more like, oh, this, and this.
Sure.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing that I like about this system is that and this is something I guess you probably see a lot more in the OSR side. And anybody that is an OSR player, if you have your impressions of how you play OSR games, and if that kind of resonates a lot with you, a lot more than say like D&D 5th edition or Pathfinder, where there's a lot more equality in the character creation process and everything like that. Let us know your thoughts. Because in this particular case, the nice thing is because if you adhere to the rules and you say to yourself, okay, we're just going to play the game as it was designed and as it was intended, you end up being forced to make some interesting choices because the stats that you get aren't the stats you manufacture for the character that you see in your mind. So as Jeff had mentioned, when he rolled his stats down the way, and I was using that optional rule to let them re-roll if their stats were too low, because I didn't want to have like a person in like a hospital gurney bed like running through the dungeon kind of thing, because they're 3s all the way down. But it did if he had in his mind, if he imagined himself to be a fighter for this particular game and he rolled a 5 for strength, it didn't say you couldn't be a fighter, it just implied that maybe you wouldn't be the most effective fighter kind of thing. So it kind of forces you out of that shell where you choose your you kind of pre-select a lot of these things, then make the numbers work to what you want to be. And I do like that about the game, because it means that you don't you don't kind of stay in your own little space, and it forces you to expand, and you learn a lot more about the game when you're forced to make those decisions, in my opinion.
Yeah, it also causes this is one of the things that stood out to me, and I talked to somebody I consider him my OSR expert kind of, and I talked to him about it. But like, to me, one of the things that I don't like is there sort of can be an easy character inequality. Like I rolled fairly well actually, which was kind of a surprise. I think I had a 17 in strength and a 16 in constitution. And because strength has impact on your carry weight, like there was this inequality of like, I could carry a lot more stuff than Jeff's character. And for a game that's kind of bent around like looting and taking stuff and carrying stuff, like they're developed this kind of character inequality where my fear, I wasn't running the game, Mike was running the game, but my fear would be that there just becomes sort of this like character inequality where it feels like one person is having all the fun doing stuff, while the other person doesn't have as much opportunity. Like I could have carried almost everything that we found in the dungeon out in the short game that we played, whereas Jeff's character couldn't. And yes, there is that, well, your character's not just going to keep it all, you're going to split it all if you go back to town or whatever.
Well, it depends on your character, right? Like...
but still there's that moment where it's like, but I'm still doing all the, like, I'm still looting, I'm still carrying things, I'm still saying, oh, I'm going to carry this, or no, I'm not going to carry that. And then it forces a choice on a player that maybe that they wouldn't need to make if there was more character quality. Which, I mean, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe I'm spoiled by modern games where there is a little bit more character equality or that sort of thing. But I could see some players not enjoying that, that sort of thing.
Well, this is the thing that always is interesting. It kind of harkens back to when I first started playing, because when I first started playing, there was an importance about being good at what you did, and at least you didn't want to make quote unquote bad characters, right? And stats was always a big start. And I know that you guys started a long time ago in those early editions and all that, but I know that when you played with friends, like and it was always that pure rolling dice roll. You'd roll your dice, you'd be like, oh man, I got really lucky because I rolled a 15 in there, and you were like, heck yeah, let's do this. And then you had that friend that showed up at the table, they're like, I rolled 2 18s and a 17, so, and you're like, did you though?
Yeah. I'm just better at everything than you are. Oh,
yeah. Cool. Not just a little bit, but like significantly better.
Scads, yeah.
Especially in the beginning and all that stuff. So, and I think there is like that little bit of like not, I don't, would it be envy, jealousy? I mean, can that appear in these kind of games? But like,
it could.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, like that's a pretty harsh term, I think, but I mean, it is to a degree, but I wouldn't say it's that strong. But it's just like, I don't like, it's hard to get your little bit of, your slice of time if you just don't seem as good at anything as anyone else. And it's a little bit better for this sort of game because like thieves definitely have a role. Like, for example, we came across the portcullis and the pit trap. If Jeff hadn't been a thief, like we would have had no way to know that was actually there, and we just would have fallen into it. So that's another weird thing that's kind of weird about this game. So if you have a thief, it seems almost pointless to have traps from the perception of they just find them.
You could, it's like if they look, they find them, but there are times in which you force rolls. And I think that with the tension that comes from rolls and everything like that, I was having a hard time finding the balance with the classes to understand how to have that tension created by a dice roll and all those kind of things. Cause it's still new to me and all that kind of stuff. And I wasn't seeing it necessarily with how things were lined up.
But I think in a strict reading of the rules, and again, I had another conversation with somebody who reads a lot about OSR. In the strict reading of most OSR rules, Shadowdark included, like, that's just what thieves do. And so, they just do it. Like, I made my argument that we kind of talked about where the player has to be kind of aware and say, I'm looking for traps. And he said, no, that's not really the case. Usually they just find them. It's just their role, and that's just what they do. And so, and then even he said at that time, he's like, and I don't know why you would put, he's like, I guess why even include traps then? And
somebody may or may not have a thief.
Right.
And
but the problem then is if you don't have a thief, and this is where then you're dead. Like, and then you're just dead.
Well, like, I mean, you might be dead. We didn't fall into the trap, so I don't necessarily know. And that comes down to that with the trap, but
that comes down to that party thing again, where having like the actual like necessary party becomes important for these types of games.
I did feel personally, and there was only two of us, like so we understand that we were not fully pushing, the game engine.
We had not optimized our party.
No, I would have felt better with 2 or 3 more members of a party, to make us a little bit bigger. To provide us with, a few more options. Some healing might have been nice. Although, with my 1 hit point, I was going full range combat and staying out.
Yeah, you really only had 2 states. You were basically alive or dead. Like
right. Yeah, no,
and maybe alive or dying. I guess you could.
And I will say, for the first time in a long time, I felt a super amount of peril. I have died at first level in many games, but between the having to strategize what my character could carry, because I could carry far less than Brent's character, talking about our torches, talking about just me trying to stay range combat and, losing all of my arrows as I shot them, there was a certain amount of tension that was generated by that was sort of reminiscent. I mean, I remember finding, and I swear to God, the DM was being a bastard, but I remember finding a treasure like at the end of a dungeon, right? And it was like 500 silver pieces and like 3,000 copper pieces, right? And we were like, we've made it. And then the GM's like, so remember encumbrance?
Yeah.
Do you know what
and that would happen. And that essentially
had it been 13 platinum pieces, we'd have been out just fine, right? Yeah. Or a gem. But no, it's this massive pile of tiny coins, wheelbarrows of pennies. And we're trying to, we can move this rock and bury it under there and then put a secret mark. Like, we never went back.
Yeah.
But most of our treasure stayed in the dungeon.
That's funny.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I would say is, you just need to play more aggressive, because I feel like I'm in peril pretty much every time I'm in combat with any of my characters. That might be my lack of tactical acumen, though, I suppose. But yeah, so and I had fun. Like, everyone's probably going to hear me say negative things about Shadowdark, but I did have fun in playing our game.
Hmm.
I just think there's things that the game, and we've talked about this a little bit on the game. I think some OSR games, definitely one that's angled more towards the dungeon crawly style, is probably not my style of game, especially to run. It doesn't mean I don't enjoy to play in, but it definitely isn't one that I would run. But it makes me rethink other games that are kind of OSR oriented. Like everybody talks about Troika as an OSR game, which is a game that I've liked so far in reading. And we'll probably use one of our Monday nights, kind of like Shadowdark, and run a short game on it. But like everybody says it's kind of OSR, but OSR seems to mean now it's just a simple rule set, because Troika isn't even a D20 based system. So I don't know how it's kind of lumped into that OSR bundle now, but it made me think about those sorts of games.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, again, it's ruling is over rules. I think is one of the main mantras that the OSR gaming community says. And of course, just in case anybody hasn't heard that term before, old school revival, old school Renaissance games. That's kind of what we're talking about here when we're talking about OSR. And so I think that when you're looking at just how the gameplay went and everything like that. And I think in terms of like the type of gameplay that it led to, is that it doesn't lead to heroic gameplay, especially at first level. And so I think when we built these first level characters, it almost feels like, there was a sense that you guys just picked up your pitchforks and were off to a dungeon kind of thing. And that's not bad. I mean, there definitely are games that I've had that have those kind of humble beginnings, and it kind of goes a little bit farther than that. But when I looked at like the advancement tables and everything like that, is very much like into the loot and everything. And so I think there is definitely a balance that I wasn't sure that I wasn't sure how that would be struck when you have so many of your gear slots taken up by just your normal adventuring gear. Like, how do you really get anything out of the dungeon? So to kind of like talk about Jeff's point, it's like, well, how do you get the coinage? How do you get the gems? How do you get that, gobble it out? Because it's like, now the DM has either got to be, it's either got to be a gear slot, or the GM is just going to hand wave and say, you just got to, your Santa sack full of treasures that you basically say, and that's just one gear slot, and I don't know the right answer there for this particular game, but it did feel like there was some balancing issues that I it's a resource that I wasn't expecting to have that it would require so much micromanagement, because you just don't get many slots. Like, I think Jeff, after just buying the Adventurer's Kit, he has 3 slots left, and so he was like, he was kidding full. Up was taking all of his gear slots.
I actually handed Brent a couple of things.
Yeah, I was carrying his extra
so I could
stuff.
have armor and weapons, and
because I had 20 slots.
But that's part. I mean, not everybody's going to find it charming, but I think that's part of the charm, is having to make some of these decisions, having to make some of the strategic decisions in the role playing as to how you handle combat and what you try to do. Because I think a lot of the OSR games, like, there's more than just the mechanical dice roll, hit, don't hit, subtract hit points. You can say, I'd like to do this, or I want to do that, and maybe a fighter could execute a challenging thing to try to hamstring the monster. I think as you get into it more, there's a little more flexibility, because the rules aren't so hardcore set and the encounters aren't based solely on challenge ratings or different things.
That can either be a positive or a negative, because that puts a lot of onus on the GM in those circumstances. That's what the rulings over rules. Is that the saying? Rulings over rules?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Rulings over rules essentially means the GM decides what happens in the game, and it's and one of the things that I get concerned about in games, when, again, the GM is sort of this all-powerful decision maker. Like, if the GM wants to win, the GM just wins. And so I feel like rules are the arbiter of kind of keeping the GM in check. And so sometimes when you have rules that dictate what both parties can do, I feel it's helpful. I feel like if you have a good gaming group, and people that you're familiar with and you're comfortable with, and they're okay with somebody making these decisions, I think is one thing. But if you have like a new group and you're not you don't know everybody. I think an OSR game gets increasingly hard because at some point you could say no, you can't do that as the GM and cause conflict within a group.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that makes me sort of wary sometimes of rules, exceptionally rules light systems. Because I try and avoid, I don't like the feels bad that can happen in gaming sometimes. Where it either feels like the GM's against you, or like when the GM starts looking at encounters like it's me versus them, like it can be really unfun for one side.
I'm tired of the party finishing all of my combats in 3 rounds or less.
Yeah, like
I think that's bad GMing though.
It is like, but sometimes they don't realize it. Like one of the examples that I always use is 3.5, which was a fairly like tactical game, like you could play with grids and stuff like that. But one of the things that always happened with one of the GMs that I had for a while is he would put some of the bigger fights, because he thought it was interesting, he would put some of the bigger fights in like areas that were advantageous to the villain that basically made it much harder for the players to play. For example, we were playing a game where it was 2 psionic characters and we were going up against the big bad. And the big bad, all he had memorized for psionics was grease spells, but we fought him on like those like poles that were 100 feet in the ground that he was hopping from. So he would just grease a pillar when we were jumping on it. So like there was like, it was like 50-50 whether we just fall to our death when we jump on one of these poles.
I'm all for a challenge, but man, that seems...
And it was cool and cinematic, but it was like environment made this hard, this encounter much harder than it should have been. So, and like you can just do that as GM. It's like, oh, I'm telling a story.
Yeah.
Well, your story's a little rough to survive.
Are you telling a story, or are we?
Well, we are telling a story.
Yeah. I don't know. I would argue that it's possible, and I think I know who you're talking about, but that's okay. It doesn't matter.
You don't. It's not him.
Oh, okay. Then
sorry to nameless person.
He just feels
sorry, nameless person.
He just has 30 bowmen on the horizon that you can't see.
As you go in to make the killing blow, elevators open up, an army pours out.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
That's
kidding. When you're chasing one guy right into the grips.
Well,
of
no,
10
because
other people.
the person we're referring to, I have played with, and I would put them in the harsh but fair, and I think that's okay. I think as long as it doesn't feel like it's us against them, right? Them being the GM, I think it's okay to have bad things happen to the party. I mean, there's a lot of people that really hate like character death, but like when you do dumb shit and your character dies.
Yeah. Well,
yeah. And I think it's less about that and more. And like I said, I feel like that's something that an OSR system could lead to, is that feeling like the GM's making rulings against me. And in some cases, it may even be subconsciously true for some GMs. Like they might not intentionally do it.
Hey, Brent. Who hurt you?
Lots of people. But no, Mike, you're one of the fairest GMs I've ever had. But
I know we joke about Mike's GMing a lot. We do. It is constant, but
it's a lot of hyperbole. Hopefully,
well, and I've been in situations where I've made rulings that people didn't like and were angry with it, and I didn't realize that they were taking it as personal as they were. And then it elicited a conversation afterwards. You know, so and I find, and like I said, what it comes down to is sometimes rules are nice because you can say, well, rules is written, this is how it's played. Whereas if it's just somebody saying, no, I don't like how that is, sometimes that's a lot harder to defend.
No, I have gotten in my career into a lot. I'm one of those players that read a lot of books, or I was. I've gotten much more, you know, go with the flow, story, character, you know. But I have gotten into a lot of rules lawyery beefs about exactly how things read. And sometimes I was right, sometimes I was wrong. I don't even remember what any of them were at this point. I just know that I was probably a player that a lot of GMs hated to have at their table. And I think both parties are at fault when you get to that point.
Yeah, to a degree.
So here's something that I think is interesting about the rules light, and I you know, I like rules, but I also like the ability for us to, as a group, make decisions, and I think that's the one thing that this type of game engenders. And I think right now we can probably move on to from characters to the actual
Sure.
gameplay component and stuff.
Mhm.
But you know, I think that, you know, to kind of counterpoint Brent here is that if you have a GM that's making decisions kind of solely by themselves, I think that can be a little bit tricky because I don't know if that's necessarily in the spirit of it. I think that sometimes it turns into more of like a discussion about, like, you know, like the GM, because you could GM fiat anything, and of course, as you said, the GM just wins, right?
Mhm.
But the idea could be is that, you know, you want to do something, and then the GM goes, okay, well, help me understand how you think that would work. You know, you're like, well, and then of course, as you go through the discussion, you kind of create an amicable solution for it. And I think that's a way that you can be fair about some of those things that aren't necessarily expressed in the rules. But at the same time, I think that there is a chance that, you know, the GM could just on the spot make a ruling that just sucks. I mean, I've done it in the past. Yeah, this is how it works. And then of course, you know, people's memories run deep. That always comes back to bite me in the ass later. So whatever. But I do like having the rules too, because, you know, I mean, it is nice when it's just kind of explained, because I think that people playing within the confine of the rules allows us to have fun within that rule set, and it's not contingent on me making the right decision, or you know, having you know, a great philosophical discussion about you trying to do something on the spot, and what the ramifications of it are. So I mean, there's definitely strengths and weaknesses to both sides, but um getting into the gameplay component of it, the gameplay, you know, I mean, it seems like it's medium on the dice rolls. You know, I think with you when you look at like some games like D&D 5th edition, you know, there's a lot of dice rolls like, oh, roll a perception check, roll this kind of check. This one doesn't really encourage that kind of rolling. There's really only rolling in a few situations where, you know, like there's a chance of failure, there's time pressures, you know, there's things that make it so that you just can't be the trained professional that you are. And so I think that having fewer dice rolls but more impactful dice rolls is something I personally strive for as a DM, and I don't think I'm there yet. I think, you know, I still sometimes have superfluous dice rolls that after I make you guys roll the dice and I do my kind of mental inventory of how a night goes after a game, I go, did I really need to make them roll that dice, or was I just hankering for them to roll some dice to say, yeah? Digital dice aren't very satisfying to roll anyways, so
Not as satisfying, anyways.
yeah. But when you get to the other parts, the gameplay, you know, I mean, the gameplay is pretty simple and plays a lot like, you know, a D&D game, like an OSR game, but with a few D&D modern touches. Now, the one thing that's really different was kind of the dungeon initiative turns. And I mean, we ditched that like fairly quick. But for you guys that may not know what we're talking about, is that in this game, there's a suggestion or a rule. I mean, I don't
It's
know
a
how you
rule.
want to it's a rule, but maybe it's more of a suggestion that you do dungeon initiative. And this, I don't think this is the only game that has had the dungeon turn, quote unquote, but I think that there's, you know, those types of games, I really don't, I mean, that type of rule just makes it feel way too board gamey and a lot less role play and it's cinematic when it's like, Brent, make your move. Well, I moved two nears. Okay, well, you move 60 feet ahead. You know, here's what you find as you move. You know,
It was interesting because I listened to the Shadowdark, the writer. I listened to her play Shadowdark on a YouTube channel, and it was pretty interesting because it felt more like how we were doing it, where it wasn't very impactful. And basically, she was just using it as it felt like it was used more as just like turn order, like hey, you go, then you go, and then you go, which I don't feel is necessary. I mean, if you have a really rambunctious group where people step on each other, like, or can't decide who to do what, I think that's necessary, but it definitely wasn't necessary with two of us.
Yeah, and maybe that is a good reminder to make sure that everybody is engaged with the process, you know. And so there might be that kind of thing, but it feels like it kind of is it's just a weird mechanic to me that I don't play with in our even in the stuff that we do that are dungeon crawls from like a game and everything like that. We just free form it, you know, theater of the mind. We have used virtual tabletops and everything like that in the past, and I feel like virtual tabletops, I do like them for dungeon crawling specifically, especially if you can use like Roll20's ambient light feature. That was one of my favorite ways to do it. I think Roll20 as a site for me just doesn't work very well. It's like slow and clunky.
Anything where you can hide parts of the map are probably good for dungeon crawly stuff, just for immersion purposes.
Yeah, because I mean, I think back in the day, people used to like, there used to be a cartographer in the group. You know, they would like draw out the map, and their accuracy to the map would be, you know, it would basically tell how likely you were to survive. Really necessarily feel like it was necessary unless you wanted to use it as kind of a way to keep time and make sure that everybody was participating or something like that. And maybe that's the intention. There's the amount of rules that are written here is pretty light. So if there is any intention behind any of these rules, that is obviously left out in many cases. But I think we can move on to the next part when we talk about so the reason why this game is called Shadowdark, right, is because you're going into the dark. And so the one thing that you really have to focus on is torches and light sources and everything like that. So there is a resource management component. And I felt like, I mean, we used a timer to use the resource management component, right? We didn't use that kind of 10 turn suggestion that they had for it. And I mean, as a DM, I mean, I wasn't just like, ooh, almost out of torches. But for you guys, did it feel like it was more pressure when you were playing it, or?
I forgot about it mostly, like until like we were close to the hour. Like I had just forgotten about it. Yeah. I think one of the things that in this game you have to do is really stress the fact that you're carrying the torch, or you dropped the torch. Like when we were in the combat we were in, one of the things that probably we should have narrated better was dropping the torch, instead of, because it maybe putting it out, like, and then having to light another torch, because I think that's,
well, you guys have been murdered if you put out that torch.
Well, like, yeah, but if you drop it and it gets snuffed out on accident, like there's really nothing you could do about that. And I think that's kind of the I mean, there's another like little thing you have to keep track of, is whether or not you're in a situation where the torch might go out. And so I think that didn't help me. Like, I think that's one of the reasons I forgot about it. But when you mentioned it, it was kind of a big deal. Like that was, and we talked about it and how like the resource management part is important. Like you have an hour on this torch. How many torches do you have? How far do we go? You know, I was more worried about the fact that I had like 4 hit points left after the combat. Like that was stressing me out a little.
Yeah. The game is straight up lethal if you get hit. And I'm not just my character that had 1 hit point. Brent actually had a fairly generous amount of hit points, but after one combat and getting hit a couple of times because I was nowhere close to the monsters, you know, he was almost like, I don't know how far we would have made it. Like if Brent would have died, I would have thrown out all of my adventuring gear, grabbed whatever treasure I could, lit a torch, and booked.
I will say one other thing that's funny about Shadowdark as a game is it definitely encourages you to, like, the minute that I saw that skeleton had chainmail on it, I was like, oh, I'm taking that. Whereas in more narrative games, I would have been like, nah, I don't really need it or whatever. But I was definitely like, oh no, that's an upgrade. I'm taking that.
Yeah, you needed the upgrade.
I need that 1 or 2 extra points of AC to make sure that I don't just get murdered next time.
Yeah,
so the system does encourage that.
It does, and it's actually interesting because I think that does harken me back to my younger days when, you know, when you fought a monster, you were like, okay, now what kind of gear does it have, and can I salvage it? Because I really need some gear, man. Really, like, you know, do you have any gear? I really need some gear. Give me some good gear, you know.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's good because that's, I mean, part of the fun of some of these dungeon crawl type games is that you do get good loot. You explore and you get loot, and so you power up that way.
I do have one question for you. This is something that I heard in the playthrough, and I was just more curious if you saw it in the rules anywhere. Rewarding XP. Does it suggest anywhere in the rules that you do that at the end of the game, or do you do it when it's acquired. Because one of the things I noticed in the real play is the minute that they got a gem or something, she was like, oh, you get a pearl. It's worth 250 gold, and you get an XP because you found loot.
Because so there's two different books, and so the player's guide didn't really say anything about any, kind of anything other than like level advancement or anything like that. And so XP awards are based on like the quality of the treasure and the boons you gain during the session, and that's kind of a direct quote in there. And so they suggest you can either do it right away or at the end of the session. I think that it really turns into like, what does your party want to do? And so I guess from the game and how it could be played is that if you're playing a large enough dungeon and you have enough stuff, is that you could technically level up while you're going through that dungeon, and then just express that in the form of, because you got this pearl that was two experience points.
Yeah, that was what I was kind of where I was going with the question. Is it a situation where you spontaneously level up in the dungeon? What is that like? Is there anything about that? Like, do you need training or anything, or is it? I mean, is there any downtime in Shadowdark? I guess not. Probably. Right?
They don't really have it, at least. I didn't really see anything, and I'll be honest, I didn't see anything. And I know the quick start rules aren't maybe going to be as fully as robust as the actual game and everything like that. But I didn't see any downtime or training requirements. So I mean, I don't mind the idea of spontaneous leveling. I mean, that's kind of a 5th edition conditioning for me, where you just you've earned the number of experience. I just don't like slowing gameplay down for that. And so like the one thing that's interesting about it, and this is kind of like combat encounters and everything, is that if you, for encounters that you have planned, usually you probably give out more treasure than random encounters. Because I think if you have like a random encounter or something like that, the random encounter doesn't have as much, like, so like when you do random encounters and everything like that, the GM has basically got a sliding scale for how dangerous the environment is. And if it's unsafe, it's every 3 rounds. And this is where it gets to be part of that dungeon initiative. So every 3 dungeon initiative rounds, you have to check for an unsafe encounter. Right. And if it's a risky area, it's every 2 rounds. And if it's a deadly area, it's every round. And they basically roll a d6 and roll an encounter based on a 1. And if you guys do anything loud or disturb the environment in such a way that you might draw attention, you can also do a check kind of out of turn for that. Now, I think the one thing that is that when you get treasure on random encounters and everything like that, they mentioned that it's only a 50% chance of they having any treasure. So you may not get any treasure for that. So there's going to be, it's not like searching out random encounters is not the way to get money.
So the other question I would ask in the Shadowdark's DM guide, does it tell you how to integrate the new character into the party when you're 3 dungeon levels deep? Because if you're doing random encounters along with anything planned, your characters are going to fucking die.
or get in good shape from running away from everything.
Because like I couldn't imagine. So was the skeletons that we ran into, was that a random encounter? Was that a plan? Did you put that plan? Did we run in random?
Okay. I didn't, because of how short of the dungeon was, I didn't worry about random encounters. You guys were grave robbing. All the graves were restful. Because otherwise I would have rolled when you had to force open the door. Otherwise I would have rolled this. You know what I'm saying? There were
right. I'm just saying times. Like every time you make one of those rolls, you're now flipping a coin whether or not party members are going to die. Like, because combat is super deadly. And so like that's another thing that's funny to me about like this type of game is like, all right, we're 4 levels into the dungeon. Bob died. Where does this other guy come from?
I don't think he does. I think you meet somebody up when they get to town. Bob gets to have a beer or a soda.
Bob the second is in a cage somewhere. Like, I guess you could do something about it, but like it's just one of those weird things where it's like Bob's out of the game.
Well,
like we're playing Elimination Chamber now, where it's like All right, we're gonna mark these players. We're like a board game where people get eliminated, where it's gonna come down to, 2 people like fighting over the board, and like 4 people that are like, I could have done anything else with my life in the last hour.
The thing that you mentioned here, I didn't actually think about this, but like, what happens when you die? Like, is it you just die and then like you have to be brought back to town for resurrection? Like, is it kind of hubby like that where you're adventuring town, you have a priest that helps you recover your players, or is it just, as you said, you just die and you're
Well, what happened on
Bob's the cousin came to town?
what happened on the live cast of the game was, which this was pretty entertaining in a OSR game, is the guy, I've told Mike and Jeff this, but in the live cast, a character ate a fruit that another character just gave to them that he found, and and he bit the fruit, and she's like, okay, well, you lose 1 permanent hit point, and then the player said, I only have 1 hit point, and then she said, well, you're not getting it back. And then so what happened in their game was another guy that had stowed away on the boat got off the boat and joined the party, and because they were still like out on the beach, and one of the characters had already died as a mermaid was chasing them. But like, so it's like, yeah, so I think that could get harder the more esoterically you're placed in a dungeon. It's like, oh, Bob's dead. When's Bob 2 gonna just wander around the dungeon, and or another dungeoneer got lost and we found him or something? I guess you could, like I said, you could probably make it up, but it's one of those things where it's like, story wise, it's a little bit.
I mean, I do like the concept of the lemmings just all getting off the boat. Like, there's just an endless supply of stowaways. That's pretty funny.
It is funny.
Well, it's definitely a type of game.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Sure. So I guess when we talk about those kind of things like death and all those, I mean, I did feel like that was the one thing that I didn't see a really good component for, is that like if you're building like a game, and this is a critique of like the monster statistics and everything like that, is that the book is written, and I think it has like 30 monsters in it or 40 monsters. It's a few pages of monsters, right? And they're monsters that you're familiar with, but because it's now embedded in this system, it's kind of unclear as to like which monsters are good based on level or there's like no design. There's no design, for the encounters and all that kind of stuff. So as you go through the dungeon, okay, so you get to the dungeon, you go into a room. I have assigned 2 skeletons in here because there's 2 of you.
Well, see, yeah.
And so there's.
Go ahead. No, go.
I was just going to say, so there's a chance that you may just kill the party because you overestimate their abilities. But then again, that definitely turns into a game of fight, avoid, flee, the FAF approach, right. I guess, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing, is like your players need to make a decision. Like, do we think we could win this fight? If no, we book it out of there or sneak past them or whatever. Yeah. And those are really your options. And I think honestly, smart parties, most of the time, if they can, that's what they're going to pick.
Yeah.
Because it becomes really important in this sort of game to choose your fights. Because it's a resource management game. If you're low on hit points, you're limited in your resources and choices you can make. If there's a fight you can't avoid, that's the one you should fight, not the ones that you can avoid.
Yeah. So. But it's tricky too, because like how do you avoid fights when you're the light source carrying, torch wielding party in the Underdark kind of thing? It's like,
yep, that's what you need to decide. Like, how exactly do you do this? And you try and outsmart the DM. That's what you do.
It's true. And so like I said, I mean, like, and I think I mentioned to you guys is that, there's nothing to tell me when an aboleth would be a better monster
every
than
time.
A skeleton.
Every time, every room in your dungeon should have an aboleth in it.
Just
a
school of aboleth.
Sure. That sounds great.
Just an aboleth sitting in the center of the room, and then you say, okay, guys, figure it out.
Yeah.
Have fun.
the aboleth notices you. It enslaves one of your party members. Somebody roll a d20 wisdom check.
Aboleth has goods, has wares. If you have coin, what? That was unexpected.
Legally distinct but unexpected. So that's really the only critique that I have. And so I think I said we'd have a shorter episode, and we're crawling up to our normal episode time pretty quick. But I think when I look at Shadowdark, I think it very much feels like, it hits a lot of the OSR stuff, and it looks like they put some twists on it to make it a little bit better. But I think if we look at the game itself, it doesn't excite me maybe as other games do. So why don't we go ahead and I guess we'll review this in terms of, just give your final thoughts on Shadowdark, and of course we'll let the people know if we play it ever again. But Jeff, why don't you go first? What are your thoughts? Final thoughts. Close it out.
All right. I had kind of a positive Renaissance kind of feeling, it kind of took me back to the days when dungeons were dangerous and we weren't having fights and then long resting everywhere. And I enjoyed some of the things that are there to keep the pace going. I don't know if I want to play a campaign in it. I'm not opposed to it, but I don't know how I see how my characters would live long enough to play in a campaign. If I'm being honest, it's a lethal system. Not everybody's going to die, but there was things that kind of took me back. I kind of liked not having 800,000 rules, or I had to take a check every time my character wanted to take a piss. Do a nature check to make sure a snake doesn't bite you on the hoo-ha. So
that's a random encounter. You wouldn't have to roll for that. That would be Mike rolling for that and seeing if it happened.
Sure, but
you encounter a snake, it bites you on the
tail. I liked it. I especially for one shots. I could see me running it for people, especially with some of the pre-generated dungeons. I don't, in a convention setting, or if you got friends sitting around and they're like, "Oh, you're into this role playing stuff. Tell us about it." Yeah, maybe it's not the best introductory game, but maybe people would have fun. The rules are simple enough. I think you can teach on the fly, and I had fun in our session. I always have fun though when we play. So, but I'll tell you what. How about this? It made me want to try things like Troika and Morkborg that I didn't necessarily. I'm not necessarily super, OSR guy, but I think it was neat, and I think the fact that they had such a successful Kickstarter is amazing, and I look forward to more stuff from Arcane Library. I liked it.
Okay, Brent.
I enjoyed playing in the game. I think I had a lot of fun playing in it. But again, to echo what Jeff said, I enjoy every time you play. There aren't very many games that I've ever played in that I didn't enjoy. There are a few that have frustrated the hell out of me, but in the end, I enjoyed them. Would I run an OSR game like this? I probably wouldn't. One of the things that I say about any game, though, is there's things in it that you'll probably like, and you should probably take those and, maybe implement them in your own games. One of the things that I do think would be very cool, either in it would need to be done in person in a game, but I think one of the things that you could do is if you get some sort of light or make some sort of torch that had an hour timer on it and let it dim as as a prop. I think that would be really cool in a con setting potentially for a one shot. Those physical things that add some flavor to the game. I think a little bit of physical narrative I think would be good. As I've gotten more into my gaming career, I prefer more narrative games. But one of the things that this did help me realize is there are definitely cool things you can do with super rules light systems, and made me think more about the rulings versus rules kind of debate, and how you can kind of force the rules to be permissive versus restrictive. I still kind of prefer, I think, in my heart, more narratively focused games. But I do love Troika, and Troika is the OSR centered game that I really want to try. It kind of made me not want to try Borg. I don't think dungeon crawls are necessarily my like strict, like I feel like these games are designed to run in a dungeon. I don't feel like those are my sorts of things. But like games that are more creative and rules light, like Troika and into the Odd and Electric Bastion Land, and like some of those more just rules light games that kind of get lumped into OSR that really probably aren't. It made me want to try those a little bit more. And like I said, OSR is great for some people. It's just probably not something that I would want to run. Overall, it was a positive experience. And I do think there's some cool stuff in, like, that's why I have so many role-playing books. It's like, there's always cool stuff you find in systems or in backgrounds that you want to use. And I think so. That's why I always encourage people to try it. So overall, I think it was positive. Good.
So I think, I think that both Jeff and Brent had said some things that I wholeheartly agree. I do kind of lean more in the category of Brent's where it's, I like a dungeon crawl. However, I don't know if I like a campaign of dungeon crawling. And so I know that this game can be tailored to do some stuff. And I'm sure that like any OSR type game, there are going to be people that hack the game. You build up enough of a base, people are going to start creating their hacks. There may be zines that are put out that help, elaborate on certain types of rules or certain types of things that you can maybe introduce into your game. And so the game could evolve into something that's very different than what it is today, 2 years from now. And but as for my journey with the game, it's probably going to be waiting for some of those evolutions, possibly to give it a second try, simply because, as Brent said, I like running dungeon crawls. I think they're fun, they're easy, but we play so many games that are virtual because we're in different places and everything like that. We have people scattered to the wind that it kind of goes onto the VTT, and right now we're playing more theater of the mind kind of games. While this is perfectly fine for it, I just feel it lends itself to in-person gaming, and I think that there are certain props like Brent had mentioned that can make it really, really like chef kiss kind of thing, really good there. But I think with a little bit of work, this will be a fine system, and I think that plenty of people will get their money's worth out of it. I think the art in it is awesome. I love that monochromatic art that they have going on the books. And I think that the simplicity of the rules, old school art is cool. And I think the simplicity of the rules is something that I miss for a lot of games. It takes a really practiced hand to write rules easily. And have it be digestible and everything like that. It may not be perfect because in its simplicity, that doesn't tell you every permutation of how this rule could be, abused and, misused and all that stuff. But I think that, there was a really good job making the rule system easy. I honestly, like I said, last time when we talked about it last week, I really read the rule book in like a night. And you guys know me, I don't just read front to back rule books. I like reading the rules as it's necessary and all that stuff. So it was good, but I think honestly it was a good game. Lent itself really good to the dungeon crawl. I still need to practice my own OSR toolkit, so I'm a little bit better at running that style of game. But as a GM and a person that likes to improve himself, it's just, hey, I chalk it up to learning, and I feel like I can run that type of game even better now. So I like the game. Just may not be a game that I'm going to touch for a little bit of time.
I will say one thing. One of the things that I did notice on the Arcane Library YouTube channel is they are adding more classes. It looks like they've been doing work streams on, I think, the Bard and the Ranger for development streams. I don't know if those are stretch goals or not, but it does seem like they're adding more classes and stuff like that. So the game that is in the quick start rules may also not be the game that comes out in book form entirely. It might be, a little bit more fine-tuned too. So but overall, I think it was a positive experience, and we look forward to playing at least trying other OSR games in this kind of format, I think. So
So final verdict, it seemed like we enjoyed it enough, and if you're really into dungeon crawlers, this might be a good game for you to try a little bit of a different approach, OSR with a modern twist. See if it's the game for you, and we'll kind of keep an eye out if we see some exciting news or hacks about Shadowdark. We won't hold back. We obviously aren't like saying, oh, we didn't like Shadowdark. And just because we're not able to play it, we only have so many gaming hours a week that we can dedicate to games. Just because it won't be our game of the week, it doesn't mean that we won't keep an eye out for updates and, of course, share those as they become available.
And up the tension. Brent's idea about the torch timer, seriously, you've got to have an old tablet sitting around, put a timer app on there, and count that sucker down from 60. Ratchet up stop the effing around in the dungeon.
Yeah, any sort of like props like that, interactive props like that are really
I
cool.
think that would be amazing.
That would be for this side of game. It would definitely be amazing.
Sorry to hijack the wrap up, Mike.
Yeah.
Hey, you know what? Fuck you. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and send it off on our slightly shorter episode. And so, Jeff, do you want to tell people how they can get a hold of us?
Yeah, if you would like to talk to us, you can certainly leave a comment at the bottom of the video. You can reach us on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook at Rollwise. Or if you'd like to email us, it's rollwiseguys@gmail.com.
All right. And thank you to everybody that listens, subscribes, follows, all of that kind of jazz. And so I think, Brent, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, a quick thank you to everybody that's commented on YouTube. Please keep the comments coming. We do enjoy seeing what everybody thinks. If you do have any suggestions on any games that you might want us to take a look at, please let us know. There is one game that we'll never play. I'm not going to say its name because I said it enough last week. And let us know if you like this format. You like us trying a game and then kind of talking about it and doing a little review. Other than that, as always, be safe out there, take care of each other, and always roll well and roll wise. And see.